Now on BBC Radio 4, the dark side of a Victorian poet is explored in The Afternoon Play.
What's to be Done with Algernon by Michael Allen. The year is 1905. The place, a house called The Pines on Putney Hill. The Pines is the residence of Theodore Watts-Dunton, the well-known literary critic and lawyer, and his close friend, the poet Algernon Swinburne. Mr. Watts-Dunton has just finished writing a letter.
There, that's done. The last letter. I think I've now done my duty by all my friends and relations, written and told all those who need to be told. All things considered, I think Algernon took it very well. After all, ours has been an unusual relationship, as Edmund Goss pointed out only the other day.
Algernon Swinburne and Theodore Watts-Dunton, your household has all the characteristics of a homosexual ménage, without the slightest desire on either side for physical contact.
Oh, Goss is quite a wag. But of course it is true that Algernon and I have lived together for a great many years, and taking all that into account, there was certainly every possibility that he might take a dim view of what I have in mind. But no, he took it very well. I chose my moment carefully, of course. I waited until after dinner yesterday evening. It had been a good day, a fine May morning, and Algernon had had a particularly stimulating walk on the common. Then lunch, and a nap, and then at about 6:30 he read to us as usual. Algernon has read to this household every evening for the past 26 years, and in this fashion we have worked our way through the entire works of Dickens twice. Then we had dinner, and after dinner Clara and her mother went home, and I, having instructed cook to make sure that we were not disturbed, I sat Algernon down in the drawing-room with a cup of coffee. I trust you enjoyed the rack of lamb, Algernon?
Oh, excellent, Theodore, excellent. And the jam roly-poly, too. Just like I used to have it eaten all those years ago.
One of your favourites, I know. That's why I chose it. And now, Algernon, if you're quite comfortable, I have something particularly important to say to you.
Oh? And what can that be, I wonder?
At first, Algernon was wary. No doubt he recalls those many painful occasions in the past when I've had to warn him that his conduct was likely to lead to trouble. And here I was again, yesterday evening, telling him that I had something of great consequence to impart. So, naturally, he was a wee bit cautious at first. But I soon put him at ease. Oh, no need to look like that, Algernon. This is good news. At least, I hope and believe it is good news. Now, Algernon, you will have noticed, I'm sure, that over the last 5 years or so, Clara and her mother have been frequent and honoured guests in our house.
Oh, yes.
And, of course, Clara has been more than a guest. She has been most useful to me in my work.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed, Theodore. She is a very delightful girl, is Clara, and most obliging.
Yes, quite. I'm sure it will not have escaped your notice, Algernon, that I have grown increasingly fond of Clara.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed. I have noticed the affection between you. She has such lovely dark eyes.
Yes. In fact, we have become so fond of each other that well, after considerable thought and not a little hesitation, I have asked Clara to marry me.
To marry you? Why, Theodore, how wonderful!
Do you know, his face lit up with pleasure. And then, a few moments later, his eyes were filled with tears. Algernon is simply the best of all friends a man could hope for. He thought about what I'd said for some time, and I remained silent. I watched him carefully, and to my enormous relief I saw in his face not a trace of doubt or envy or fear or dismay, all emotions which a man in his position might reasonably be expected to feel. After all, we have lived a bachelor life together for over a quarter of a century, and now here I am proposing to change the situation completely, but not, I hope, in any way which would disadvantage him. When it seemed appropriate, I spoke again. I want you to understand, Algernon, that I propose absolutely no change in the domestic arrangements, at least as far as your position is concerned. I expect you to continue to live here and share this house with me, and now with Clara, just as you have in the past. Algernon? I don't think he heard me. His mind was elsewhere, on other times, other places, other people. And anyway, I don't think the idea that my marriage might change anything had even entered his head. After a moment, he looked up.
My dear fellow, forgive me, I should have said this immediately, but I do offer you my most sincere and heartfelt congratulations. Please, allow me to shake you by the hand.
Oh, thank you, Algernon.
I have always believed that marriage is the most gracious condition to which a man can aspire. I long ago accepted that it is one of life's great joys that have regrettably passed me by, and for you to have achieved it so late in the day makes you doubly fortunate.
Yes. You have touched upon the one point on which I must confess to having had some doubts. There is, after all, a certain gap in years between Clara and myself. I am, we both realize, old enough to be her father.
Yes. Well, actually, Theodore, since you are 73 and Clara is 21, you are comfortably old enough to be her grandfather.
Do you know, I had to admit he was right. Later that evening, Algernon had a sudden thought.
We must order a crate of champagne, Theodore. Champagne is the stuff for weddings.
No, Algernon, I think not. Champagne is indeed sometimes drunk at weddings, but I think we will stick to what we know best. Good, honest ale in small quantities, and tea for the ladies.
Oh, well, it is to be your wedding, Theodore. Yours and Clara's. Whatever you decide about the ceremony, I shall be honored to be a guest.
I was anxious to avoid all talk of champagne, of course, because when I first brought Algernon here to the Pines in 1879, he was, by common consent, a hopeless drunk. For years, his friends and family had struggled to get him to drink in moderation, or better still, to give it up entirely. All persuasion had failed. His drinking caused him to behave most foolishly in public, and in private he suffered from a form of alcoholic dysentery, which sapped his strength and made him ill for weeks at a time. The doctors had warned that if the situation did not change, he would surely die. But Algernon seemed incapable of change, and everybody had written him off as a lost cause. Everyone, that is, except me. I brought him here, with his family's full approval, and nursed him back to something like normal health. Then, when he took to drinking again, I made no attempt to stop him for some weeks. But the day came when I went into his study and picked up the brandy bottle. You know, Algernon, I can't think why you drink this beastly stuff. It's a medicine, really, fit only for the sick room. Do you know what I think? I think port is the drink for poets. Oh, I was talking to Tennyson only last week, and he recommended some really marvellous stuff. I've got a drop downstairs if you care to join me.
Oh, well, I have the greatest respect for Tennyson's judgment. Port, you say? Oh, yes, I'll certainly try some.
Algernon was intrigued by this new tipple, which was, of course, much less damaging to him than brandy. So I kept up the campaign. Port was the drink for poets. That was my motto for the next couple of months. And then I said, you know, Algernon, I'm rather surprised that with your love of France, you aren't a more dedicated student of French wine.
Ha ha! I rather think I've drunk my share.
Yes, but my dear fellow, you're not the connoisseur you should be. I think we ought to make a bit of a study of them, you and I.
Well, by all means, if you wish, Theodore. There's rather a good wine merchant in Putney High Street. I often spend ages looking in his window.
Yes, quite. I think we'll undertake a little research. Draw up a proper programme. And so, for the next few weeks, we worked our way steadily through the clarets and burgundies and chablis. And each week we moved to a slightly less potent product of the grape, a wine with less alcohol in it. And finally, after many months of the most careful preparation, I began to talk to Algernon about good, honest English ale, Shakespeare's Brown October. Of course, since you and I are Englishmen, Algernon, we ought not to neglect the study of our own alcoholic beverages. What do you say to a glass of beer with tonight's meal?
Oh, quite acceptable to me, Theodore. I often have a refreshing pint in the middle of my walks.
Yes, I tell you what, we'll work our way through the lot. Newcastle Brown, Yorkshire Bitter, Irish Stout, and then the local brews. We'll make ourselves Putney's experts on ale. How does that sound?
Oh, fascinating, Theodore, fascinating.
And so we went on, the great poet and I. We made a journey on a river of alcohol, from the source, where the strong spirits were undiluted, down through the meadows, where the wine was less destructive, to the broader reaches, where the beer was relatively harmless. The outcome was that within a year, without any outright prohibition, and without any fuss or bother, I had transformed Algernon Swinburne from a hopeless dipsomaniac into a man who drank 1 bottle of beer a day, and no more. And so it has remained until this very moment. Lady Jane Swinburne, Algernon's mother, was kind enough to pay me a compliment before she died.
Mr. Watts-Dunton, your name will go down in history.
Favourably, I do hope, Lady Jane.
Certainly. In addition to being known as a critic, poet and novelist, you will be remembered by posterity above all for having saved my son from a wretched and ignoble death.
Why, thank you, Lady Jane. It was a compliment I was most honoured to receive. So, beer it will be when we toast the bride, and 1 bottle each at the most. As we went up the stairs together last night, Algernon was ahead of me. He had been quiet for some time, no doubt thinking about the prospect of my forthcoming marriage to Clara, and evidently he'd also been remembering my own long-standing interest in the Romanies, the wandering tribes of Europe. When we reached the landing, he turned to look at me, his face filled with wonder.
Just think, Theodore, after all these years, your own dark-eyed gypsy girl at last.
Oh, dear.
Something wrong, Theodore?
Yes, I'm afraid there is.
Well, not something I have done, I hope.
Oh, no. No, my dearest Clara. I would not have you think that for the world. No, it's just that a matter has come to my attention through this morning's post. A matter on which I shall have to speak rather severely to Algernon.
Oh, dear. Well, you won't be too hard on him, I trust. I'm sure he cannot have done anything really bad.
Well, that depends on one's definition of bad, my dear. In this case, he has been not so much wicked as foolish and reckless.
Well, is it something you can share with me?
Oh, I regret that it is not, Clara. It is a matter of, of some delicacy. Algernon?
Oh, yes, Theodore, do come in.
I trust this is not an inconvenient moment?
No, not at all, my dear fellow, not at all. Just drafting a letter to the editor of The Spectator. Would you care to read it?
In due course, Algernon, in due course. But first, does the name Frank Fane ring any bells with you?
Frank Fane? Ah, well...
Yes, you see, it has come to my attention, Algernon, that you have been contributing under that name to a periodical called The Pearl.
Yes?
A periodical with which I was not at all familiar, but now that Goss has lent me a copy, well, what can I say?
Well, quite an amusing little journal, I always feel.
Amusing? Huh. It wouldn't be amusing if it came to the attention of the courts, Algernon. Most unamusing, I would say. Indelicate is the politest term I can apply to its contents, and obscene is what the prosecuting counsel would call it.
Oh, dear. A little too, strong, is it?
Too strong? Algernon, I have to make it plain to you that all communication between you and the publishers of this disgusting magazine must cease immediately.
Well, if that is your view...
It most certainly is my view. I mean, just imagine the consequences if you carelessly left a copy lying around and my wife were to come across it.
Oh, I don't think Clara would mind. She's always rather enjoyed the bits I've read out to her.
What? What? You mean you've actually read passages to Clara?
Oh, only carefully selected bits, Theodore. Nothing that would bring a blush to a maidenly cheek. Not that she is a maiden anymore, of course. Now that she's married to you.
Now, look here, Algernon. It must surely be obvious that for a man in his late 60s to be indulging in schoolboy ruderies and naughtiness is really too absurd for words.
Yes. Perhaps you're right.
I most certainly am right. And furthermore, common politeness requires that you should not read aloud to my wife anything which I have not previously approved.
Oh, dear. If I have erred in my judgment, Theodore, I apologize. But I meant no harm, I assure you.
I'm afraid Algernon was quite downcast when I had finished my admonition, and so he should have been. Apart from occasional disturbances of that sort, life at the Pines, following the arrival of Clara, has now settled down into a happy routine. Well, fairly happy. Algernon and I did find that Clara soon forced us to change our bachelor ways.
Books, books, books. Books everywhere in this house, and all of them covered with dust. Has it ever occurred to you, Theodore, and you, Algernon, that books need an occasional shake out of the window?
Well, no, I can't say that it has. I've never been one for shaking books out of windows. Have you, Theodore?
No, but I dare say the house could do with a spring clean.
Oh, and a spring clean it will get. There will be a flinging open of sash windows, a banging of brooms, and a thwacking of a rug such as you two gentlemen have never seen. And then there's that cruet stand.
Cruet stand?
Yes, Theodore, that hideous object which lives on the dining room table. It is either me or the ghastly cruet stand. One of us must go.
Oh, well, in that case, I will keep you, my dear, if I may.
I think, Theodore, we must start to entertain guests. We should have a regular select little salon on Sundays, don't you agree?
Oh, well, it would be interesting, certainly.
And you, Algernon?
Oh, fascinating, my dear, fascinating.
There have been good times and bad times at the Pines, and today is one of the worst. I have sent a telegram to Sir Douglas Powell. Dr. White tells me that he is the greatest living expert on fevers of this kind, so we must hope for the best. It all seems to have happened so quickly. Yesterday morning he came downstairs as usual, cheerful as ever.
Good morning, Clara.
Good morning, Algernon. You slept well, I trust?
Never better, my dear.
Considering he's such a small fellow, he ate a monstrous breakfast.
Another egg, Algernon?
Well, if you insist. Wouldn't you rather Theodore had it?
Theodore is quite stout enough as it is, Algernon, without you encouraging him to greater excess.
After breakfast, Algernon spent some time talking to my wife. They sat together in the window seat in the drawing room, and pretty soon, as usual, he had her giggling like a schoolgirl. Which is more or less what she is, really.
Oh, my dear Algernon, you must not tell me such improper stories. Theodore will be most upset. He pretends not to listen, but I can see him frowning from here.
Oh, well, that story wasn't really improper, my dear. I could tell you much worse ones than that.
After a while, Algernon came over to speak to me. I was sitting there reading the Times and not listening to their conversation.
I say, Theodore, I'm rather sorry to learn that although I made a special point of buying you 6 oysters yesterday and stood over you while you ate them, only 2 of them worked.
I mean, really, what can one do with the man? He is still absolutely incorrigible after all these years. He will be 72 tomorrow, and I'm sure Clara would never dream of discussing the intimate and personal side of our marriage with him. At least, I don't think she would. But then how did he know that 2 of them worked? Anyway, at about 11 o'clock yesterday morning, Algernon went off for his walk. He has gone for a walk on Putney Heath and Wimbledon Common every morning for the last 30 years. Rain or shine, it doesn't matter. The worse the weather, the better he likes it. Never wears an overcoat. And yesterday's walk was not much different from thousands of others. Except at the beginning, of course. There was a slight disturbance at the beginning. I should explain that Algernon has an absolute passion for babies, and he keeps dropping heavy hints.
4 years you've been married now, Theodore, and still no sign of a family. You better get started.
My dear Algernon, you really must bear in mind that oysters or no oysters, I am 77 years old.
Ah, a mere youngster. Plenty of time yet.
Be that as it may, Algernon likes happy, fat, chuckling babies for preference, and given the slightest encouragement, he will shake rattles at them, make cooing noises, and generally behave like someone who has entered his own second childhood. Fortunately, most of the nursemaids and young mothers around here are well aware of Algernon's predilection and make sure to keep out of his way. Yesterday morning, however, a new and inexperienced young nursemaid was pushing a perambulator almost directly outside our door as Algernon stepped out into the sunshine. He hailed her, and the hapless wench was rash enough to come to a halt.
Oh, I say there. Young lady, do just stop for a moment.
Yes, sir?
Algernon was upon her in a trice, poking his face into the pram, tickling the baby under the chin, coochie-coochie cooing like a mad thing.
Oh, my dear young lady, what an absolutely delightful child you have here. See how pleased he is to see me. Is he yours?
No, sir. I'm not his mum, sir. I'm just taking him for a walk, sir.
Oh, I say. I really must have a cuddle on this one. Out you come, my little beauty. Come and say hello to your Uncle Algernon.
Oh, sir, please don't pick him up, sir. Oh, please, sir, no.
Contrary to the young lady's wishes, Algernon picks up the baby and proceeds to throw it up into the air and catch it.
Woo!
Woo! Please, sir. Put him down, sir. Help me, somebody. Help me.
What's going on?
Oh, sir, please, sir. My baby.
Passers-by stop and take sides, and a small crowd assembles. Some comfort the nursemaid, some shout at Algernon, others argue that he is perfectly harmless.
Harmless, I know him well.
The nursemaid doesn't think he's harmless. Look at her.
Absolute pandemonium breaks out right in front of the Pines, and there is nothing for it but Clara and I have to rush outside and calm things down.
Put that baby down.
Ladies and gentlemen, please!
Oh, look, Clara, look. Isn't this just the most beautiful little baby you ever did see?
He is indeed a very pretty child, Algernon, but we must return him at once to his pram.
Oh, but no...
Now, Algernon, this instant.
Oh, well, if you think I should.
There. That's better.
Yes. Oh, he's such a lovely little chap. I'll write a poem about him.
Write a poem, indeed. He will write 4 poems about that baby, and on a bad day it will take him all of 35 minutes. With some difficulty, peace was restored, The baby was returned to its pram, the nursemaid was settled down and sent on her way, with strict instructions from Clara to follow a different route in future, and the passers-by were mollified by the knowledge that they had been introduced to Putney's most distinguished resident, Mr. A.C. Swinburne. And I, at last, was able to return to my work. Apart from that incident in the morning, yesterday was, as I say, a perfectly ordinary day. It came on to rain, of course, poured down, but then it often rains. Algernon returned from his walk soaked to the skin, but then he's often soaked to the skin, and he changed into dry clothes as usual. Yesterday morning, I can confidently say, his face beamed with pleasure and good health. At lunch, I asked him that same question that I have asked for 30 years, and which I never tire of asking because I have never heard the same answer twice. "Well, Algernon," I said, "and how was the heath today?" In answer, he described the grass, the flowers, the people, the clouds, the rain, all in the most exquisite detail, with a richness of language, and with that strange, childlike joy which never ceases to amaze us. After lunch, Algernon retired for a nap, and later on, after a few hours' work, he came down to the drawing-room and began to read to us. The routine never changes, and as long as we live, it never will. Regular hours, regular meals, regular habits. Those have been the making of Algernon Swinburne, and it was a regime which I instituted. The prisoner of Putney, the newspapers call him. But they can say what they like. I know, because I have seen it at first hand, that through the discipline which I at first imposed upon him, but which later he gladly embraced, I have secured for Algernon Swinburne 30 more years of productive life. However, yesterday evening it was obvious, even as he began to read, that he was feeling ill, and he soon retired to his room. By 8 we had put him to bed, and by midnight he was delirious. Clara sat up with him the whole night, and in the morning Dr. White came. Now I have been obliged to telegraph for Sir Douglas Powell. I fear for Algernon. His constitution is sound, and we will give him the very best of care and attention, but I fear for Algernon. Algernon and I often observe that there is nothing which people enjoy quite so much as a nice, juicy scandal, provided it involves somebody else. When it's close to home, people usually hate it, but Algernon used to thrive on scandal, even when it involved himself. Today's newspapers would have given him endless entertainment. What a pity he's not here to enjoy them. Some of Algernon's obituaries were really most generous, and one of them seems to have infuriated the canon of Canterbury Cathedral. He is now said to have preached a sermon attacking Algernon's poetry in the most brutal terms. It is, he says, responsible for corrupting an entire generation. Sexual morals will never recover, the empire will disintegrate, Christianity will fall apart, and Armageddon will overtake us. I paraphrase somewhat, but not much.
It is a new doctrine, and one to be strenuously resisted, that men of great poetical genius are not to be held responsible for the use they make of their powers. The writer of Swinburne's obituary would have us believe that poetry is never a corrupting influence. But how can he tell that no increase of sexual immorality can be laid at the door of Swinburne's poetry? It requires but little knowledge of souls to know that there is no more deadly poison than the portrayal of corrupt passion in flowing and artistic language. It is difficult to speak of these things, even for the purpose of warning, without doing more harm than good. But when they are spoken of, not only without abhorrence, but with consent, approval, and delight, and with great literary skill, there is no more corrupt influence in the world. I do not judge of the man, Swinburne. Far be it from me to do so. He may have been much better than his poetry. I trust that he was. But certainly much lustral water and the most precious of all precious blood are needed to do away with the pollution which Swinburne's poetry introduced into English literature.
Well, the canon expresses a point of view. It is the view of those who prevented Algernon from being made poet laureate, as he should have been. But how Algernon would have enjoyed such a sermon! What a letter he would have written to the canon in reply! Smoke would have curled from the envelope as the reverend gentleman sliced it open. Oh, what fun it would all have been! But there will be no more fun, I'm afraid. Not of that kind, at any rate. Poor Algernon. Sir Douglas Powell came, as requested, but he could do nothing to relieve Algernon's fever. And to make matters worse, I myself fell ill also. I stayed on my feet as long as I could, but I too was soon obliged to retire to bed. Algernon was in the room below me, and as I tried fitfully to sleep, I could hear him babbling in Greek. In his delirium he would render aloud the choruses of Aeschylus and Sophocles, first learnt so many years ago. For a few days he remained with us, semi-conscious, but it soon became clear that he was not to recover. On the night of Friday, the 9th of April, only 10 days ago, it was plain that the end was near, and my wife came to me in some distress.
Theodore, are you awake?
Yes. What's wrong?
I'm afraid... Poor Algernon. The end is near for him.
Oh. I will come down and see him. I put on my dressing gown and staggered down the stairs to Algernon's room. He had long since ceased to speak as the pneumonia overtook him, and he lay now quite uncharacteristically silent. Pale, too, except for that still red hair on the pillow. The ends of his bed are painted with Pre-Raphaelite damsels by Treffry Dunn, and on the walls are pictures of beautiful long-haired stunners by Burne-Jones and Millet. But best of all is Rossetti's portrait of Janie Morris, lying on her sofa, arching her long, swan-like neck. And Janie Morris looked down at him now, with me. I said my farewells to him and made my way painfully back upstairs. "Oh, Clara," I said, and my wife held me while I wept. The following morning, when I awoke, I fully expected to be told that he had gone, but in fact it was not until 10 o'clock that he left us. And then began what I assumed was to be the last chapter in the very curious history of Algernon Swinburne's life. For as long as I'd known him, Algernon had been fiercely, indeed obscenely, anti-religious. What he had to say about Christianity could barely be repeated in mixed company.
Doubt is faith in the main, but faith on the whole is doubt. We cannot believe by proof, but could we believe without? God whom we see not is, and God who is not we see. Fiddle we know is diddle, and diddle we take it is dee.
It followed from this that Algernon wanted no truck with the Church of England when he died.
You must promise me, Theodore, that when I die you will protect me from the indignity of a Christian burial.
Oh, my dear Algernon, I am older than you, and you will survive me by many years, I'm sure.
Nevertheless, I'm serious. I want you to promise me solemnly that should I predecease you, you will see to it that I am not given a Christian burial.
That is your considered and final view?
It is. And as you are my nominated executor, kindly promise me that my wishes will be observed.
Very well, Algernon. I promise. So far, so simple. And I've fully intended to keep my word. But now, at the moment of Algernon's death, I was completely incapacitated by influenza. My mind was confused by fever, and my legs would scarcely obey the command to walk to the bathroom, much less anywhere else. This incapacity of mine opened the door of opportunity for Algernon's sister, Isabel. Algernon was to be buried in the family plot in the churchyard at Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight. That was agreed by all. But Isabel was determined that the full Church of England burial service would be read over his body, while I, having thought about it on my sickbed, was determined that it would not. We both embarked on our campaigns with the aid of the electric telegraph. I began by dispatching an unambiguous telegram to the vicar of Bonchurch. Sir, speaking as the sole heir and executor of the late Algernon Charles Swinburne, I have to inform you that it was Mr. Swinburne's declared wish that he should be interred in the appropriate spot without so much as a silent prayer from anyone. Kindly see to it that this instruction is followed. Miss Isabel Swinburne, representing the family, fired off an equally imperious missive suggesting that the wretched vicar was in immediate danger of being fried in hell.
Sir, my brother Algernon, the eminent poet, recently deceased, remained all his life a devout member of the Church of England. He was a firm believer in the resurrection of the body and the life eternal. My instructions to you, sir, are that you will offer all the usual observances without omitting so much as a syllable. Failure to meet my requirement in this matter may well result, sir, in my taking steps to have you removed from office.
Well, dear me. Somehow or other, as is their way, the newspapers got hold of the debate.
There's a long piece in the Times, Theodore.
Mm-hmm.
And the local papers are full of it. Everyone's wondering what's going to happen at the funeral. Whether your wishes will prevail or those of Miss Isabel. But if it's any comfort, dear, I understand from one of the maids that the bookies in Putney High Street have you down as a slight favourite.
Oh, well, that's promising, I suppose. The poor vicar of Bonchurch knew not where to turn. He acquainted both parties with the views of the other, which we had in any case read in the press, and urged us most earnestly to settle our differences. He himself sought guidance both from God and from the village lawyer, but neither seemed to offer a very clear instruction, and the exchange of telegrams continued unabated right up to the morning of the funeral itself. Come the appointed day, neither Miss Isabel Swinburne nor I was fit to travel, and Clara had to go alone. She gave me a full account on her return, of course.
When we reached the churchyard, we saw that, well, there were a great many wreaths and messages. One from the Rani of Sarawak, from La Princesse de Monaco, in token of her immense admiration and regret, and from Robin, one of the little children whom Swinburne loved.
And dare I ask what the vicar did in the end?
He did what Church of England vicars are best at, Theodore. He compromised.
As I feared.
When Algernon's coffin arrived at the entrance to the churchyard, the vicar pronounced the introductory lines of the Church of England burial service.
I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die.
This produced a very sharp rebuke from one of Algernon's London friends standing at the back of the crowd.
I say there, things have come to a pretty pass if a man can't get buried the way he wants to.
The vicar ignored the protest at the time, but at the graveside he stopped reading the burial service and contented himself with saying a few words of tribute.
There is no doubt whatever that Mr. Swinburne was a most distinguished man. As many of you know, he spent much of his childhood here at Bonchurch, and now, at the end of his life, Bond Church is proud to welcome him home.
And so on, and so forth.
And that was that.
Yes, Theodore. Your will prevailed.
Oh, not just mine, Clara. Algernon's. And I thought that was the end of the matter. I thought there would be no more public rows. I should have known better, of course. For just as scandal, uproar and controversy surrounded Algernon's burial, so they continue now. On the one hand, we have the Canon of Canterbury, who has condemned Algernon on behalf of the Church, and as spokeswoman for the opposite point of view, we have Algernon's cousin, Mary Gordon. The canon holds Algernon responsible for every sexual misdemeanour since at least 1865, while Mary Gordon has called upon me to issue a public statement. She wants me to say that Algernon remained throughout his life a communicant member of the Church of England, and she wants me to deny that he ever had a liaison with Ada Menken. Miss Menken was a music hall artiste, a rather large lady who certainly shared Algernon's interest in poetry, and the newspapers now tell us that she also shared his bed. But Mary Gordon will have none of it. She tells us that Algernon was far too well-bred even to speak to such a woman. Finally, most ludicrous of all, she wants me to declare that Algernon was never the worse for drink in his entire life. Ah! All of which is pretty ironic, coming as it does from the woman who once knew him more intimately than any of us. Mary Gordon was the one woman he wanted to marry, and it was she who drove him to drink by her cruel rejection of him. Perhaps all this noise and uproar will continue for years, until I too am gone. But in the meantime, I have to learn to live without him. I know that I am the most fortunate of men. For 30 years I shared the life of one of the greatest poets of my time, and now I have a devoted and beloved wife with whom to share my remaining years. But having lived with Algernon for so long, I find it hard to accept that he is not here. What's to be done without Algernon? And in search of solace, I turn, where else but to his poems. Yesterday, I took down my inscribed copy of Poems and Ballads, Series 1, published over 40 years ago, and perhaps still the greatest of all his works. And I slipped a penknife into the pages at random and opened the book accordingly. I found that chance had brought me to his poem called The Garden of Proserpine, that poem in which the narrator, who is surely Algernon himself, meets death. And I read there these words: I am tired of tears and laughter, and men that laugh and weep, of what may come hereafter for men that sow to reap. I am weary of days and hours, blown buds of barren flowers, desires and dreams and powers, and everything but sleep. We are not sure of sorrow, and joy was never sure. Today will die tomorrow, time stoops to no man's lure. And love, grown faint and fretful, with lips but half regretful, sighs, and with eyes forgetful, weeps that no loves endure. From too much love of living, from hope and fear set free, we thank with brief thanksgiving, whatever gods may be, that no life lives forever, that dead men rise up never, that even the weariest river winds somewhere safe to sea. Then star nor sun shall waken, nor any change of light, nor sound of waters shaken, nor any sound or sight, nor wintry leaves, nor vernal, nor days, nor things diurnal, only the sleep eternal in an eternal night.
In What's to be Done with Algernon by Michael Allen, Theodore was played by Jonathan Elsom, and Algernon by Nigel Anthony, Clara by Tracy Wiles, Edmund Gosse, Canon of Canterbury, and the Vicar of Bonchurch by James Taylor, and Lady Jane Swinburne, the nursemaid, and Isabel Swinburne by Melinda Walker. The play was directed by Tracy Neal.